Well, turn with me, if you would, to the book of Amos, chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. Now, this is the second section in the book known as the 8 judgments. The first section, of course, is the introduction, and it was relatively short. The second section is a pronouncement of judgment on 8 different nations. 6 of those nations are heathen nations, or what we would call Gentile nations. The other 2 nations are Israel and Judah. Now, in verses 11 and 12, Amos pronounces judgment on Edom, and more specifically Teman and Bozrah, which were the 2 major cities in Edom. So follow along with me as I read verses 11 and 12. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4 I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he did pursue his brother with the sword, and did cast off all pity, and his anger did tear perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever. But I will send a fire upon Teman, which shall devour the palaces of Bozrah. Now, verse number 11 begins with the common Hebraism, for 3 transgressions and for 4. And by now you should know what that means. It means that Edom was guilty of multiple sins. And these sins had filled the cup of God's wrath up to the brim. But this last sin had caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow. And now God's wrath could not be stopped. It could not be prevented. There was nothing that they could do in order to stop it. Now, this pronouncement of judgment is different than all of the others. Did anyone notice that? As we've been going through that, did you notice that this one was different? Well, it's different because in all of the others, only the 4th sin is mentioned. The sin that caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow. But when it comes to the pronouncement of judgment upon Edom, the 3 sins that filled God's cup of wrath up to the brim are listed, along with the 4th sin that caused it to overflow. And there's a reason for this. You see, judgment against Edom is mentioned in more Old Testament books than it is against any other foreign nation. In fact, there's one whole book that's just for the nation of Edom. And it's nothing but judgment coming upon them. And if you want some scriptures for me to give you, let me just throw out some scriptures that talks about judgment coming upon Edom so you can see how many times and how many places it's pronounced coming upon Edom. You have Isaiah chapter 11, verse 14, chapter 34, verses 5 through 17, chapter 63, verses 1 through 6, Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 25 through 26, chapter 25, verses 17 through 26, chapter 49, verses 7 through 22, Lamentations chapter 4, verses 21 and 22, Ezekiel chapter 25, verses 12 through 14, verse 35, Joel chapter 3, verse 19, here in Amos chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, and also in chapter 9, verses 11 and 12, the whole book of Obadiah, Malachi, even Psalms. All of these different places, God pronounces judgment upon Edom. And it's not because God is picking on Edom. It's because Edom was guilty of harboring an everlasting hatred towards Israel. But that's also why there's so many problems in the Middle East today. It's because of this eternal hatred that the Edomites have towards Israel. Listen to me. There will never be peace in the Middle East until Jesus Christ returns. I don't care what anyone tells you. All of this negotiation for peace will fail. There will never be peace in the Middle East ever until Jesus Christ returns, because the Arabs have an eternal hatred towards the Jews. And I'm going to show you why tonight. So let's look at the 4 sins that are listed in verse number 11. It says, thus saith the Lord. Now, I hope you notice that the word Lord is in all caps. What does that mean? It means that this word Lord is translated from the Hebrew word Yahweh, or as we would say in English, Jehovah. But that is the redeeming, covenant-keeping name of God. And now God is using this name because he's upset with Edom because of their eternal hatred towards the Jews. Now let's keep reading. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof. And this is different than all the others because it's going to list all 4 of the sins. Because sin number 1, he did pursue his brother with a sword. And sin number 2, did cast off all pity. And sin number 3, his anger did tear perpetually. In other words, they went overboard. They never let up. And sin number 4, he kept his wrath forever. So those are the 3 sins that filled the cup of God's wrath up to the brim. Number 1, he pursued his brother with a sword. And I'll explain in just a little bit why God considers Israel and Edom to be brothers. Maybe we'll get to that, maybe we won't. It all depends on time. But for now, you just need to know that in God's eyes, Israel and Edom are brothers. There should never be this eternal hatred between the two. In fact, if you really understand what's going on in Israel, you'll see that Israel wants peace, the Edomites don't. The Arabs don't. And it doesn't matter what the Jews do, they will never have peace. Number two, he had no pity on Israel, even when others attacked them, and more specifically the Babylonians. Even though Amos prophesied before the Babylonian captivity, his prophecy is just a part of the whole towards Edom. And one of the things that was prophesied in the book of Psalms is what they did when the Babylonians came and they destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. They actually cheered them on. In fact, anyone that tried to escape, they went and they hunted them down to turn them over to the Babylonians, and they did the very same thing in 70 AD with the Romans. It's because they never gave up. They never had any pity towards them. And number three, his anger towards Israel never subsided. In other words, they're always angry. There's nothing that the Jews can do that won't make them angry. That's just the way they are. Which brings us to the fourth sin that caused God's cup of wrath to overflow. And this fourth sin is why we have such problems in the Middle East today, and why we'll always have problems in the Middle East until Jesus Christ returns. And this is the fourth sin if you're taking notes and writing this down. Edom has an eternal hatred for Israel. Now, the way the King James Version says it here in verse number 11 is this way. He kept his wrath forever. But what that means is that Edom always has and always will have a hatred for Israel. Is everyone with me? That's what this is saying. This is what has caused God's judgment to come. It can't be turned back. Now, it's not going to be completely filled until the great day of the Lord. And then all of these things that have been prophesied are going to come to pass. But the reason it's going to come upon Edom is because of this fourth sin. They have an everlasting hatred towards Israel. Is everyone with me? Now let's find out why they have such a hatred for Israel. And to do that, we have to understand the lineage of Edom. In other words, we have to know who they descended from. Or to put it another way, we have to know who their ancestors were. You know, I know that it's not very exciting to look at genealogies. It's not very exciting to go and look at all of the lists that the Bible has. But if you don't understand those things, as you're reading through the Bible, things don't make sense. So for us to understand why they have this everlasting hatred, we have to understand the lineage of Edom. We have to know who they were descended from. And only then will we be able to understand why they had this eternal hatred for the Jews. Now, if you're smart, you know that Edom is an eponym. Everyone knows what an eponym is, right? An eponym is the person something's named after. Or in other words, it's a name formed after a person. There was a time when I worked for Bell Telephone. Does anyone know where the word Bell came from Bell Telephone? Alexander Graham Bell. So that was an eponym. Let me give you another example. Israel was the name that God gave to Jacob. How many of you remember the story in which God changed Jacob's name to Israel? Everyone remember the story? Jacob was on his way back. He'd sent everyone across the little stream. And he had stayed back behind to kind of pray. He was kind of fearful. He wanted to make sure God was on his side. And all of a sudden, this messenger from the Lord was there, an angel from the Lord. And he begins to wrestle with Jacob. And they wrestle all night long, and neither one seems to be able to get the upper hand. But you need to understand that's the way God is. This angel of the Lord could have just bam with Jacob at any time, but he didn't. He wrestled with him. And as the sun began to come up, that's when the angel said, "Let me go," and Jacob wouldn't do. He wanted to bless him. So he actually throws his hip out of joint. Very painful thing. And of course, Jacob still won't let go. And he won't let go until he blesses him. And at that point, and of course this is a Christophany, he was actually wrestling with Jesus. But anyways, what's kind of interesting about this is he changes his name from Jacob to Israel. He changes his name from dirty, sneaky thief, from conniver, from a person who will do things that aren't really honest, to governed by God. That's what Israel means. Well, the nation of Israel are the descendants of Israel. So the nation of Israel is named after Israel, the person, which means that Israel is an eponym. Most of us look at them and say, "What's the nation of Israel?" But what we don't understand is the nation is named after Jacob. But it's called by the name that God gave Jacob, Israel. In fact, Israel had 12 sons. And those 12 sons gave their names to the 12 tribes of Israel. As an example, Benjamin is the eponymous name of the tribe of Benjamin. In other words, the tribe of Benjamin was actually named after Benjamin, who was the youngest son of Jacob. So Benjamin is an eponym. So who was the nation of Edom named after? Does anyone know? The nation of Edom was named after Esau. Turn to Genesis chapter 25, verse number 30, and I'll show you why Esau got the nickname Edom. Notice what it says. Esau said to Jacob, "I'm starved. Give me some of that red stew." This is how Esau got his other name, Edom, which means red. Now, most of us know when you get a nickname, normally it's because you either did something or you resemble something or maybe you look like something. And as a result of that, they give you a nickname. Now, you don't know it now, but when I was a little boy, I had very white hair, especially in the summertime. I would get out, and in fact, it looked like it was almost bleached. It would always irritate me when I would get out there and some lady would say, "Do you bleach your hair?" Because it was literally white. But my family called me Cotton Top. But the reason they called me Cotton Top is because I looked like I had a cotton top. I wish I had that cotton top now. But anyways, you know, normally what happens is we name someone or give someone a nickname because of some characteristic they have. You know, Lisa was Dilly Dolly to her dad. I never understood why he's Dilly Dolly. Susan was Booger. It's true, she was Booger, but I don't explain or I don't tell anyone why. But anyways, I want you to understand that Esau received this nickname, and the reason he did is because this is the story of where he sold his birthright to Jacob. If you remember, he had been out hunting, and he was very unsuccessful. He had been away for 2 or 3 days, and so when he got back to the camp, he was very, very hungry, and there was Jacob, and Jacob was cooking the stew. And when he came up, he said, "I'm starving, I've got to have that." And of course, Jacob, even though he's his brother, his twin brother, won't give him a bow. But he understands that Esau is an impetuous person. He understands he's an ungodly person. He really doesn't care about the things of God, and he'll do things he shouldn't do. So he said, "Well, I'll give you a bowl of stew if you'll sell me or trade it to me for your birthright." And of course he did that. So at that point, what he traded his birthright for was for some red stew. And because it was red, they started calling Esau Edom, which means red. So from that time on, Esau became known as Edom. And his descendants became the nation of Edom. They were named after Esau using his nickname. And they were also known as Edomites. Is everyone with me? Good. Now let's find out why Esau's descendants have an eternal hatred for Israel, even to this day. And to do this, we have to look at the genealogy of the Edomites. Now, most people would start with Esau because he's the ancestor of the Edomites, right? Yeah. But we're going to start with Abraham. And the reason we're going to start with Abraham is because we want to get to the source of this hatred. We want to trace it all the way back to the original source. And to do that, we have to start with Abraham. So let's go through the genealogy of Abraham, if you don't mind. Abraham had 3 wives. How many of you knew that? How many of you thought he only had 2 wives? Or maybe 1 wife and a concubine? No, Abraham actually had 3 wives. His first wife was Sarah, but she was barren and she couldn't have children. And God had promised Abraham that through him and through Sarah, but actually it wasn't told to be Sarah until later on, but through him and his descendants, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So when Sarah couldn't get pregnant and she reached the age of menopause, they decided to take matters into their own hand, because Sarah came to him and said, "You know, I'm now in this period known as menopause. I'm no longer having periods. And so we've got to take matters into our own hand because it's impossible for me to have children." So Sarah gave Hagar, her handmaiden, to Abraham as a concubine. And of course, she got pregnant almost immediately, and she had a son that was named Ishmael. You'll see that up there. But that was not a part of God's plan. So God spoke to Abraham and told him that he would have a child with Sarah. In fact, turn with me, if you would, to the book of Genesis chapter 18, verses 9 through 15, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. It says, "Where is Sarah your wife?" the visitors asked. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. The Bible tells us that sometimes we entertain angels unaware. Sometimes we don't even know that they're angels. Well, 3 men showed up. And Abraham knew that they were special. I'm not quite sure if he knew that they were angels, but we're going to find out that actually one of them is actually Jesus Christ. It's a Christophany. But these 3 men show up. And they say, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" the visitors asked. "She's inside the tent," Abraham replied. Then one of them said, "I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah was listening to this conversation from the tent. Abraham and Sarah were both very old by this time, and Sarah was long past the age of having children. Now, what does that mean? That means she'd already gone through menopause. She could no longer have children. She's past the age of having children. That's what that means. That's really a euphemism, a nicer way of saying something that's socially unacceptable. To make sure that you understand it, I'm going to tell you what it means literally. So, she laughed silently to herself, and she said, "How could a worn-out woman like me enjoy such pleasure, especially when my master, my husband, is also so old?" Probably by this time they weren't even having sex, to be honest with you. Don't know why, but it kind of sounds like this. But notice what verse 13 says. "Then the Lord said to Abraham." Now, I want you to notice something about the word Lord. Do you notice what's different about it? It's in all caps. What does that tell you? It tells you that it's translated from the Hebrew word Yahweh. That is the redeeming, covenant-keeping name of God. Now, here's what's interesting. These 3 men are here, and they are talking to Abraham. Sarah's inside the tent listening, and then it says here, "Then the Lord said to Abraham." In other words, the Lord is one of these men. Now, the Scriptures tells us that God is a spirit. But Jesus Christ came in the form of a man. But we also know that when God reveals himself in the Old Testament, it's always Jesus Christ. So this is a Christophany. This is a revelation or a revealing of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. It actually comes from 2 words, Christ and Epiphany. So you have a Christophany. You have a revelation or a revealing of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. So then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, "Can an old woman like me have a baby? Is anything too hard for the Lord?" And there's that word Lord again. "I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she denied it, saying, "I didn't laugh." Now, I've always wondered when I read this story, because Sarah was inside the tent, and she was listening and probably shouldn't have been listening. And she laughed, and they heard it. And of course, I'm sure, because the Lord knows everything, knew what she did. And Sarah says, "I didn't laugh." So they knew that she was listening in, or at least Abraham did. I'm kind of assuming that's what she did. Sarah was afraid, so she denied it, saying, "I didn't laugh." But the Lord said, and again, there's that word Lord. So Yahweh said, in other words, one of these men is the Lord, which means that it must have been Jesus Christ. "No, you did laugh." And of course, it happened just like the Lord said that it would. And Sarah gave birth to Isaac. So Isaac was the child of promise through which all of the nations of the earth would be blessed. And we see that up on the screen. Because through Isaac, the Messiah would come. But now, because of taking matters into their own hands, they had internal problems within the family. They had strife. They had discord. They had envy. They had jealousy, to the point that Hagar was forced to leave with Ishmael, because Ishmael was extremely jealous and resentful of Isaac. And you can see why. For a long time, he was the only child. In fact, he was the child that Sarah couldn't have. And he had heard these promises that were made. And he saw his father, Abraham, and Sarah take the matters into their own hand. And as a result of that, he was the child. And yet when God did this supernatural thing, all of a sudden the spotlight turns to Isaac. And at this point, he's very resentful. He's very jealous of Isaac. And he's doing everything he can to hurt this boy. So Hagar had to leave with Ishmael, and they settled in what is now known as the Sinai Peninsula. And Ishmael actually had 12 sons, and those sons are listed in Genesis chapter 25, verses 12 through 16. You can see a list of the sons on the screen. I put it up here for you to see. Now, according to verse 18, they dwelt between what is known as Havilah and Shur, and here's a map to show you the area. In fact, I'm going to kind of show you this. This is Havilah, and this is Shur over here. Now, we've made this a box just to show you where it's at, but I want you to understand something. It wasn't in that little narrow thing. I'm just showing you that he dwelt all the way from here to here. Now, this right here is the Gulf of Aqaba. So if you come all the way down here and then come back up, that's the Red Sea. And if you went a little bit further, now you have the Suez Canal that takes you out to the Mediterranean Sea. And all of this is the Sinai Peninsula. On this side, this is Saudi Arabia. So basically what it's telling you, all the way over here into what is today the southern parts of Jordan, all the way over into the Sinai Peninsula, they dwelt in all of this area. His 12 sons did. In fact, they actually went all the way down into Arabia, and we're going to see that in just a little bit later. Now, after Sarah died, Abraham married Keturah and had 6 sons. You see, the problem was never with Abraham. Abraham was always able to have children. It was Sarah who had the problem. She was the one who was barren. She was the one that was infertile. She was the one that was unable to get pregnant, because once Hagar came to it, Hagar was pregnant almost immediately. And then, of course, when God makes this promise, Sarah and Abraham have to act in faith. And, of course, when they act in faith, they have Isaac. But later on, when Sarah dies, Abraham is still very sexually active, and he marries again, and he marries a woman by the name of Keturah. And they have 6 sons. Turn to Genesis chapter 25, and let's read verses 1 through 6. Abraham married another wife, whose name was Keturah. She gave birth to Zimran, Jokshan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan was the father of Sheba and Dedan. Now, Sheba, how many of you remember the queen of Sheba that came to visit Solomon? Where was Sheba? Does anyone know? Sheba was in what is now modern-day Yemen. It's the very tip of Saudi Arabia. And Dedan, of course, is Saudi Arabia. So basically, we're getting those names here. So we're finding out where everyone actually ends up. When we saw the name Midian, that's where the Midianites were. They were kind of where Mecca and Medina are today. But that was all Midian back then. So let's keep going. Dedan's descendants were the Asherites, the Letushites, the Lumites. Midian's sons were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldaah. These were all descendants of Abraham through Keturah. Abraham gave everything he owned to his son Isaac. Let me read that again. Abraham gave everything he owned to his son Isaac. But before he died, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines, and he sent them off to a land in the east away from Isaac. Now, this is what you need to understand. He says concubines like he had more than Keturah, but that's not what it's meaning. It's basically telling you something that happened even in the past. And what it means is he did not send Hagar and Ishmael out empty-handed. When they were sent out, it wasn't like he abandoned them, he didn't ever support them. No, he gave them a hefty amount of goods, enough livestock, enough food, everything they needed to start their life and to live a good life. Not only that, he took his 6 sons that he had with Keturah, and he gave them enough livestock, enough food, enough assets for them to be able to have a very good life. And we need to understand that. But here's what we need to see what he's saying. He did not give them what they would have gotten if he had divided it according to the customs of the day. And let me explain how they did it. Basically, he had 8 sons. He had Ishmael, he had Isaac, which are 2, and then he had 6 more sons, which were the sons of Keturah. So what you would do is you would say, okay, I have 8 sons, and I'm going to divide it 9 ways. Because the eldest always got a double portion. Everyone with me? In fact, that was the purpose of the birthright. The purpose of the birthright was to say that you are the leader of the family. And as the leader of the family and the leader of the clan, you are the one who's responsible for all of the single women, all of the young women, all of the older women, all of the widows. All the responsibility falls on you. And because it falls on you, it should not be a financial burden. So if you had the birthright, you also got a double portion. So no matter how many sons you had, you always added 1 to it because the oldest got a double portion. Everyone with me? Everyone understand what I'm saying? Now, Abraham actually had 8 sons, but he didn't do it that way. He didn't divide it 9 ways and give Isaac, because he was getting the birthright. He was getting the double portion. He didn't give him 2 ninths, and everyone else got a ninth. No, he didn't do that. He came in and said, I'm going to give you enough to have a good life, and he gave him enough. He came to his other son, I'm going to give you enough to have a good life. And he did all of that. But he had all this massive wealth. And everything he owned, after he gave the little gifts that would set them up, went to Isaac. And that's what this is saying. So here's the descendants of Abraham from his concubine Hagar and from his wife Keturah, who he married after Sarah died. Those are all of the children there. And they all lived in what is now known as Saudi Arabia, the Sinai Peninsula, and southern Jordan, which was all considered to be Arabia at that time. So they were the original Arabs. And that's very important, because today our media, our newspapers, they don't know what an Arab is. Most of you don't know what an Arab is. And as a result of that, we call people Arabs who are not Arabs. And we're going to see that just a little bit later. But every one of these sons, the sons of Ishmael, the sons of Keturah, and all of their descendants, where they settled was in the Sinai Peninsula, the southern part of Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. And at that time, all of that area was known as Arabia, so they were the original Arabs. Now, let's look at his descendants from Sarah. As most of you know, and as I've already said, Sarah had a son who was supernaturally conceived after she had reached menopause. And the reason I say supernaturally conceived is not because he was born like Jesus Christ. No, that was an exceptional birth. That was a virgin birth. Mary had never known a man. Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit. So he was God in a man's body. And we need to understand that. But when I say that Isaac was supernaturally conceived, what I mean is that the Holy Spirit quickened Sarah's body, did something to her womb where she was able to conceive, but it was still Abraham who was the father. Is everyone with me? So this was a natural child that was conceived supernatural, and that was Isaac. Now, Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, and we're familiar with that. Esau was the oldest, and he should have received the birthright, but he didn't. And the reason he didn't is because he was a very ungodly person who traded his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew. In fact, in the book of Hebrews chapter 12, verse number 16, it's talking about ungodly people and immoral people, and it tells us that we're not to be ungodly or immoral. And notice what it says in verse 16. Make sure that no one is immoral or godless like Esau, who traded his birthright as the firstborn son for a single meal. Now, in the King James Version, it says profane, but really what it means is ungodly. Someone who is just a godless person. Now, Esau was the epitome of a problem child, and he caused his parents, Isaac and Rebekah, all kinds of grief. He did whatever he wanted, when he wanted, and he never considered the implications or the consequences of his actions. And like all problem children, it was never his fault. In fact, that is the common characteristic of all problem children. How many of you know what I mean when I say problem children? I've actually done series on problem children. Let me just explain something. The reason I call them problem children is because you can't just define them in one way. Problem children will manifest in different ways. You have some problem children that have a problem with alcohol, or you have problem children who have a problem with drugs. You have some children who have maybe a problem with crime. They just tend to go that way, and they're criminals. Then you have other children who maybe are just lazy. They're good children in everything except they'll never support themselves. And they're 40 years old and they're still living with their parents. That's a problem child. So it's very hard to define exactly what a problem child is, because they actually grow up and they're in a variety of different, or they act in a variety of different ways. But they all share one common characteristic. And what is the one common characteristic that all problem children share? Anyone know? Yes, but it's more than that. Here's the common characteristic. It's never their fault. It's never their fault. The kid that gets on drugs and alcohol, it's not his fault. Well, he might have done this, but I had to do this because of that. The kid that gets in crime, he gets caught, it's never his fault. I was just doing this and the cops pulled me over. Or I was doing that, or I had to do this, or they stole this from me, so I was just getting them back, or whatever it is. It's never their fault. The child that won't work, that wants to sponge off their parents, it's not their fault they can't keep a job. It's not their fault that they can't get a job after they got this degree. It's not their fault. It's never their fault. That's the common characteristic. Now, here's what's interesting. Whatever his parents wanted him to do, and I'm talking about Esau here, he did just the opposite, just to spite them. First, he married 2 Canaanite women, which made his mother's life a living hell. Turn to Genesis chapter 26, verses 34 and 35, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Notice what it says. At the age of 40. Now, does anyone notice anything strange about that? At the age of 40, Esau married 2 Hittite wives. He's 40 years old and he's never been married. Why has he never been married? Because in that culture, your parents arranged marriages. But what this tells us is at the age of 40, he was still not responsible enough for his parents to trust him to be married. And because they hadn't arranged a marriage, he did what he wanted when he wanted. So he just went out and made his own marriage. He just actually looked over every custom, didn't care what his parents did, and he went out and he married 2 Hittite wives. Now this is kind of interesting because Jacob is just the opposite. We tend to really paint Jacob in a bad light, and we shouldn't, because Jacob was a very responsible young man. And when it says that he was a plain man, a man of the tents, what it actually means, and most people don't realize this because they don't understand Hebrew, it means that he was a great businessman. And while Esau was out hunting and fishing and just doing whatever he wanted and not taking care of his responsibility in the home, Jacob stayed around the home and he learned the family business, and he was the one that was responsible. But he was not the firstborn. Even though they were twins, he was not born first. And as a result of that, he could not get married until his stinking, irresponsible brother got married. And the parents are looking at this and saying, we cannot set him up with a wife until he's responsible. And here he is, 40 years old. Most of you, because you don't know the customs and the culture of that time, you read this and it doesn't even bother you. But anyone who's a Jew that reads this, that understands the customs and the culture, they read this and they go, oh, I was going to say a Hebrew word that's not too nice about him, but anyways, he was. I won't say it. But he's irresponsible. So he went and married 2 Hittite wives, Judith, the daughter of Berai, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon. But Esau's wives made life miserable for Isaac and Rebekah. Why? Because bad girls are attracted to bad guys. Who's the type of girls that's going to marry someone like Esau? Girls who are irresponsible. Girls who are just like him. Birds of a feather flock together. Listen to me. I know we had in Mark Gungor to speak, and I really loved everything he said, but one thing. You date a very long time before you get married. And if you see any red flags, you don't get married. Because marriage is for life. Everyone with me? So he married these women, and notice what it says. Esau's wives made life miserable for Isaac and Rebekah. Now, of course, Jacob waited to get married because he was a good son and he wanted to please his parents, and he was going to wait until they arranged it. He was the responsible one. So he followed his parents' instructions, and he went to Padan Aram to obtain a wife instead of marrying a Canaanite woman. And he also went there because Esau had threatened to kill him, and Rebekah was afraid that he would actually carry through with it. Now, the reason Esau wanted to kill Jacob was because he felt that the birthright should have gone to him instead of Jacob. You see, Esau never had any intention of honoring his word when he sold his birthright to Jacob. No, because he was not a man of integrity. That's why he wanted the blessing. See, most of us don't even understand how the birthright and the blessing work. We think they're two different things, but they're not. People, the blessing was the official impartation of the birthright. If you remember, because of what Simeon did, he couldn't receive the birthright, and as a result of that, Reuben, Anyways, he couldn't receive that. Joseph was going to receive it. Joseph's going to get a double portion. Well, Joseph has 2 sons. Instead of giving Joseph the double portions, which would have gone to each son, he brings his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And if you remember, Jacob's there, and he crosses his hands when he blesses them. Why is he blessing them? Because the blessing is the official impartation of the birthright. And of course, it upsets Joseph because he's got his right hand when he crossed them. He's got him on his younger son because he had arranged them where the right hand would be on the oldest, Manasseh. But Jacob said, I know what I'm doing. The birthright goes to the one God chooses who's the most responsible. And he puts it over on Ephraim. And Ephraim, that's why they were always the dominant tribe. That's why the 10 tribes of Israel many times are referred to as Ephraim, because they received the birthright. But anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's what I want you to understand. The blessing should have gone to Jacob in the first place because Esau had sold it to him, or had sold the birthright to him. But Esau was such an ungodly person, he was not going to honor that. He had no integrity. And what's worse is that Isaac was not going to honor it. And the reason he was not going to honor it is because he had become accustomed to enabling his son. And it drove a wedge between Isaac and Rebekah, because Rebekah saw that he's irresponsible, and you want to give him the birthright, you know it's to go to Jacob. And when he sold it to Jacob, Rebekah was so happy because she's the one, if Isaac dies, that's going to be depending upon the most responsible person, the one who has the birthright. But Esau, like most parents of a problem child, became accustomed to enabling him. And so he wasn't going to make Esau live up to his word. He wasn't going to make him honor his word. And so what does he do? Instead of doing what you're supposed to in the custom, which is having a big banquet, bringing all your children in, and you bestow the blessing in front of everyone. So everyone knows this is the person who has the birthright. And then you give a token blessing to everyone else. That's what Jacob did. If you ever go back and read the end of Genesis, you'll see that he did all of that. And here, Isaac is, and he knows Esau shouldn't get it. He knows Rebekah's upset with him. He knows he sold it to Jacob. But you know, he's just like every father enables a problem child. He knows he's got a good heart. I get so tired of hearing when you parents say, but they got a good heart. When you tell me they got a good heart, that tells me you got a problem child. But he's got a good heart. And so he's going to do it. Well, Rebekah does something she shouldn't have done. And Jacob should have told his mama, no, I will agree with that. And of course, they tricked him, and you know the story. So he goes in there, and boom, he thinks he's giving the blessing to Esau when he's really giving it to Jacob. Now, when Esau realized that Jacob would receive a double portion of the inheritance and not him, he did everything he could to spite his parents, like it was their fault, not his. That's what a problem child does. Turn to Genesis chapter 28, verses 8 and 9. I'll show you what I'm talking about. It was now very clear to Esau that his father did not like the local Canaanite women. So Esau visited his uncle Ishmael's family and married one of the Ishmael's daughters, in addition to the wives he already had. Now, he didn't do this to please his father. He did this to spite his father. You see, there have been some scholars that actually have written in commentaries, when he realized they didn't want him to marry Canaanite women, that he tried to please them by marrying daughters of Ishmael. Oh no, that was not the reason. He did this to spite him. He was thinking in his mind, well, if my dad doesn't like the Canaanite women, he's really going to hate the daughters of Ishmael. Because Ishmael was the antagonist to Isaac. In fact, the whole reason he had to leave the family is because all he did was pick on Isaac, to the point that Rebekah had it and said, I will not allow this young man to do this to our son. And that's one of the problems you have with blended families. Blended families were never a part of God's plan. But sometimes they happen. But those are the problems that you run into, and that's what took place. So what he did was, he went to the extreme. If this ticked mom and dad off me marrying Canaanite women, well, I'll take it a step further. Ishmael, who's the antagonist to my family, I'm going to go marry one of his daughters. And so, let's keep reading. His new wife's name was Mahalo. She was the sister of Nebaioth, which is the firstborn son of Ishmael, and the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son. So Esau actually married his first cousin, the daughter of Ishmael. And Esau went to live in the same area as his uncle and father-in-law Ishmael. How much more could you slap your parents in the face? I'm going to leave you, and I'm going to go live with my uncle Ishmael, who left because of you. Oh, yeah. And his children, Esau's children, continually intermarried with the descendants of Ishmael, and they became the nation of Edom. But here's the deal. Both Esau and Ishmael were problem children. And what's the common characteristic of all problem children? It's never their fault. In fact, both of them, Esau and Ishmael, resented Isaac to the point of hatred. And they instilled that within their children, who instilled that within their children, and on down the line. You see, from Ishmael's point of view, it was all Isaac's fault that he and his mother had to leave the family. It wasn't his fault for picking on him and for making fun of him and for mocking him, and when he's walking, tripping him and throwing rocks at him and trying to scare him and do all of these different things. Oh no, it was all Isaac's fault for making him look bad. And Isaac was why he wouldn't be the heir to Abraham. From Esau's point of view, it was Isaac's fault for giving the birthright to Jacob. It was Jacob's fault for being a goody two-shoes and sucking up to their parents and making Esau look bad. It wasn't his fault for not being responsible for his actions. It wasn't his fault for selling his birthright. He wasn't responsible for all of these things, which is the typical perception of a problem child. Now, the Arabs are the descendants of Abraham through Esau, Ishmael, and the sons of Keturah. Listen to me, because you need to understand. The original people in the Middle East were either the sons of Isaac through Jacob, so that you had the sons of Jacob, or the Arabs were the ones through Esau, Ishmael, and the sons of Keturah. So this is what you need to understand. Iranians are not Arabs. They're Persians. Egyptians are not Arabs. They're Egyptians. Turks are not Arabs. They actually come from the steppes, the plains that go all the way from the Black Sea all the way to the beginnings of the origin of China. Yeah, where the Scythians were. True Arabs are the descendants of Abraham through Esau, Ishmael, and the sons of Keturah. So take a look at the slide. And let me expound on this. Here's what I want you to understand. From these 2 points, all of these are going to be Arabs. Let me expound on that. Put that up there on Arabs so they can see that. From Esau, Ishmael, and their children, all from Hagar and Keturah, all of these are Arabs. And all of them dwell in the area that's known as Arabia. And that's why they were called Arabs. Now, let me read something to you so you'll understand. This is from Josephus. Anyone have the complete works of Josephus? This is my paperback edition. It's not my hard copy version. I wouldn't bring that out here. Someone might touch it. And I don't want you to touch it, but you can touch my paperback. Let me read, if you don't mind, what Josephus says about the true Arabs. And of course, Josephus was right after the time of Christ. So notice what this says. When the lad was grown up, talking about Ishmael, he married a wife by birth an Egyptian, from thus the mother was herself derived originally. Of this wife were born to Ishmael 12 sons, and he names them: Nebaioth, Kedar, Abdil, Mibsam, Duma, Mishma, Massa, Hadad, Timah, Jatar, Naphish, and Kedemah. These inhabited all the country from the Euphrates to the Red Sea, and they called it Nabatean. So the Nabateans are part of that. They are, now listen to this, an Arabian nation, and named their tribes from these, both because of their own virtue and because of the dignity of Abraham, their father. So they were the original, according to Josephus and from some of the other early historians, they were the original Arabs. And this is what you need to understand that the media doesn't understand. Now let me go a little bit further, and I'm going to end with this. Muhammad was an Arab. He was a descendant of Ishmael. And he had an intense hatred of the Jews, which he incorporated into the religion that he created, which is Islam. And through the spread of Islam, the hatred of Israel was passed on to all Muslims. But my point is this: almost all Arabs are Muslims, but not all Muslims are Arabs. And we have the tendency to think if they're a Muslim, they're an Arab. And that's not true. In fact, the majority of Muslims are not Arabs, but I want you to understand it started with Arabs. That's where it's based on. In fact, all of the customs that you see in the Islamic faith, they come from the 7th century nomadic Arabic tribe customs and culture. Now, through the teaching of Islam, Muslims are taught to hate Israel. Is everyone with me? Good. Because this is why there is an everlasting hatred. And we're not only told this in the book of Amos, we're also told this in the book of Obadiah. It also mentions it in the book of Psalms. The Edomites hate the Jews. And it all goes back to Ishmael and Esau and their descendants intermarrying, and they become the Arabs. And an Arab starts this religion that incorporates this hatred of the Jews within it. So to this day, we have this hatred. And of course, I'm not even close to finishing, because now I need to talk about where the Edomites settled, but that's going to be next time. And we're going to talk about where they settled, and we're going to talk about who the Edomites are today. Because not all Arabs are Edomites, and not all Edomites, well, I should say not all Arabs are Edomites, but all Edomites are Arabs. And we need to know who they are today. And if you know that, you'll understand why there will never be peace between the Palestinians and the Jews. And the Bible tells us that.